and Jimmy felt so exalted he was a-tingle with something that was almost happiness when he finally dropped off to sleep that night. But martyrdom in theory and practice differs woefully, and as would-be martyrs have found out from time immemorial. It was all very well to decide alone and in the dark that he would give Jamie his chance, but it was quite another matter really to do it when it involved nothing less than the leaving of Pollyanna and Jamie together almost every time he saw them. Then, too, he was very much worried at Pollyanna's apparent attitude toward the lame youth. It looked very much to Jimmy as if she did indeed care for him, so watchful was she of his comfort, so apparently eager to be with him. Then, as if to settle any possible doubt in Jimmy's mind, there came the day when Sadie Dean had something to say on the subject. They were all out in the tennis court. Sadie was sitting alone when Jimmy strolled up to her. "You next with Pollyanna, isn't it?" he queried. She shook her head. "Pollyanna isn't playing any more this morning." "Isn't playing?" frowned Jimmy, who had been counting on his own game with Pollyanna. "Why not?" For a brief minute Sadie Dean did not answer. Then, with very evident difficulty, she said: "Pollyanna told me last night that she thought we were playing tennis too much, that it wasn't kind to Mr. Carew as long as he can't play." "I know, but " Jimmy stopped helplessly, the frown plowing a deeper furrow into his forehead. The next instant he fairly started with surprise at the tense something in Sadie Dean's voice as she said: "But he doesn't want her to stop. He doesn't want any one of us to make any difference for him. It's that hurts him so much. She doesn't understand. She doesn't understand. But I do. She thinks she does, though." Something in words or manner sent a sudden pang to Jimmy's heart. He threw a sharp look into her face. A question flew to his lips. For a moment he held it back. Then, trying to hide his earnestness with a bantering smile, he let it come. "Why, Miss Dean, you don't mean to convey the idea that there's any special interest in each other between those two, do you?" She gave him a scornful glance. "Where have your eyes been? She worships him. I mean, they worship each other," she corrected hastily. Jimmy, with an inarticulate ejaculation, turned and walked away abruptly. He could not trust himself to remain longer. He did not wish to talk any more just then to Sadie Dean. So abruptly, indeed, did he turn that he did not notice that Sadie Dean, too, turned hurriedly and busied herself looking in the grass at her feet, as if she had lost something. Very evidently Sadie Dean also did not wish to talk any more just then. Jimmy Pendleton told himself that it was not true at all, that it was all falderall, what Sadie Dean had said. Yet, nevertheless, true or not true, he could not forget it. It colored all his thoughts thereafter, and loomed before his eyes like a shadow whenever he saw Pollyanna and Jamie together. He watched their faces covertly. He listened to the tones of their voices. He came then in time to think it was, after all, true, that they did worship each other, and his heart, in consequence, grew like lead within him. True to his promise to himself, however, he turned resolutely away. The die was cast, he told himself. Pollyanna was not for him. Restless days for Jimmy followed. To stay away from the Harrington homestead entirely he did not dare, lest his secret be suspected. To be with Pollyanna at all now was torture. Even to be with Sadie Dean was unpleasant, for he could not forget that it was Sadie Dean who had finally opened his eyes. Jamie certainly was no haven of refuge under the circumstances, and that left only Mrs. Carew. Mrs. Carew, however, was a host in herself, and Jimmy found his only comfort these days in her society. Gay or grave, she always seemed to know how to fit his mood exactly. And it was wonderful how much she knew about bridges, the kind of bridges he was going to build. She was so wise, too, and so sympathetic, knowing always just the right word to say. He even one day almost told her about the packet. But John Pendleton interrupted them at just the wrong moment, so the story was not told. John Pendleton was always interrupting them at just the wrong moment, Jimmy thought vexedly sometimes. Then, when he remembered what John Pendleton had done for him, he was ashamed. The packet was a thing that dated back to Jimmy's boyhood, and had never been mentioned to anyone save to John Pendleton, and that only once at the time of his adoption. The packet was nothing but rather a large white envelope, worn with time and plump with mystery behind a huge red seal. It had been given him by his father, and it bore the following instructions in his father's hand: "To my boy Jimmy, not to be opened until his 30th birthday, except in case of his death, when it shall be opened at once." There were times when Jimmy speculated a good deal as to the contents of that envelope. There were other times when he forgot its existence. In the old days at the orphans' home his chief terror had been that it should be discovered and taken away from him. In those days he wore it always hidden in the lining of his coat. Of late years, at John Pendleton's suggestion, it had been tucked away in the Pendleton safe. "For there's no knowing how valuable it may be," John Pendleton had said, with a smile. "And anyway, your father evidently wanted you to have it, and we wouldn't want to run the risk of losing it." "No, I wouldn't want to lose it, of course," Jimmy had smiled back a little soberly. "But I'm not counting on its being real valuable, sir. Poor Dad didn't have anything that was very valuable about him, as I remember." It was this packet that Jimmy came so near mentioning to Mrs. Carew one day, if only John Pendleton had not interrupted them. "Still, maybe it's just as well I didn't tell her about it," Jimmy reflected afterwards on his way home. "She might have thought Dad had something in his life that wasn't quite right, and I wouldn't have wanted her to think that of Dad." End of chapter 24.